Okay, you just wait for a while for the others to come in. I think there's still people coming in. Right, about 1 more minute. Okay, I think I'll start now. Hey, good morning to all. Thank you for tuning in today on the weekend. So today's talk is together with Dr. Yeo Kang Shua. It's part of the series of 4 conversations that we had. Previously, we have Robert and 𝗘𝗫𝗛𝗡𝗥𝗦, and with Daryl as well. So this is a part from, it's a program on the hoarding commission that Daryl and I did with Singapore Museum. So today, why do I invite Dr. Yeo is because he's an expert in architectural conservation and had, like Dr. Lai, both of them has quite a influence on my illustration work. I think there are still people coming in, so just give it a minute or so. Oh, I see Midori is here as well. Hello. Dr. Lai is here as well. Hello, 𝗘𝗫𝗛𝗡𝗥𝗦. Can see you inside here also. Okay, I see some familiar faces. All right. So now I'll start now. So Dr. Yeo and I, we actually went on a few trips before the pandemic was here. Yeah, in fact, I see Midori-san has said hi from Kyoto. Yeah, so I actually went with Dr. Yeo and Sweeting to Kyoto, where on the first trip he was actually looking for pigments around the ancient capital that he was using for reference for his conservation work in Singapore. Then on his second trip, we went to some of the landmarks around Kyoto to look at how they did their conservation work and to look at the architecture. So we went to Byodoi in Uji with Professor Miyagi, and then we also went to 𝗘𝗫𝗛𝗢𝗑 in Kyoto, and there was actually some conservation work going on while we were there as well. So one of the reasons why I actually went, besides also because I like to visit Kyoto, is that he tend to share things that are beyond my perspective, and I always look to him and Dr. Lai for their critical take on what is the proper way to depict certain architecture. And like Dr. Lai, if you have spotted him in one of my works, you also can spot Prof. Yeo and Sweeting in some of my works as well. So one of the projects that both of us worked on then was in 2016. It was this building at 𝗘𝗫𝗛𝗡𝗥𝗦 Medical Hall, the former 𝗘𝗫𝗛 Medical Hall, opposite Hong Lim Park. And it was also then where he introduced me to the different kinds of dialect architecture. So 𝗘𝗫𝗛 Medical Hall is an example of Cantonese dialect architecture. And some of the illustrations I did for him was for one of these commemorative book. So this is the work I did of the former 𝗘𝗫𝗛 Medical Hall. And to also of interest to me, because I was quite into food history around Singapore, was he was sharing about these hawkers that used to be in front of the 𝗘𝗫𝗛 Medical Hall, called and it's referred to 𝗘𝗫𝗛𝗡. So some of the hawkers you still can find around Singapore, if they are not closed because of the pandemic. So it's the You can find like akao mushroom pork. Then there's a 𝗦𝗘𝗔𝗞𝗘𝗥𝗦 xiang as well. And we also did, because of background architecture, so we also did some drawings of how it's cut away of the 𝗘𝗫𝗛𝗡 Medical Hall. And besides that, because of his influence and Dr. Lai's influence, that it also kind of shaped on how I look at certain places around Singapore when I draw. Sometimes I'll ask him for his advice on how certain Chinese characters are being depicted on the signboards. Like, is it traditional Chinese or is it transitional Chinese during the period where Singapore is switching from traditional Chinese to simplified Chinese? And I have a lot of role also because of the many Teochew food you can find there. So Dr. Yeo is actually a Teochew, and him and his wife are very into traditional Teochew cuisine. And sometimes we'll talk about Teochew cuisine as well. And so yeah, this is just a short introduction of what Dr. Yeo do and how it influenced by artwork. And here is a clip on the mural at 8Q that you can visit. It is up till 6th of June. So I'll show you a short video of it. So this is the mural at 8Q. In front of the former Catholic high school. This is the former St. 8Q. So if you have the time, you can go and visit. And someone has shared in previous sessions, you can see certain heritage buildings inside this work that is mixed with Daryl's illustrations of animals and birds around Singapore. So here are some of the buildings that you can find inside this mural. Another shot of the mural. If you are unable to go, there's also this website where you can view the mural online. And if you're interested, you can also follow me on Instagram or Daryl on his Instagram handle. So now I'll pass it to Prof. Yeo, and he will talk and share about architectural conservation. Okay.
Thank you, Xin Li. Let me share my screen first. So first and foremost, I would like to thank the Singapore Art Museum, Xin Li and Daryl, for inviting me to share a short 20 to 30 minute sharing session. Because of the nature of the sharing session, 20, 30 minutes, I would like to ask a series of questions and ponder upon the questions. Perhaps this sharing would prompt more questions and for us to reflect on the issues pertaining to architectural conservation and history. So first and foremost, I would like to start to ask this question, because we are talking about layers in architectural conservation. So what is architectural conservation? So is there such a thing as a good architectural conservation? And correspondingly, is there such a thing as a bad architectural conservation? And then of course, the next question is, can conservation be wicked? So I would like the host to help me share a poll. I will leave the poll on for 30 seconds. And for everyone to try to answer the poll, right? So this poll is essentially to prompt certain questions that I would like to thread throughout my presentation. So while leaving the poll up there for 30 seconds, or maybe let me continue. So I asked this question, is that the wicked problem, can conservation be cast or framed as a wicked problem? So what is a wicked problem? All right, so the questions, the two poll is actually trying to understand what is a wicked problem. So a wicked problem is actually a social or cultural problem that is always rather difficult or sometimes impossible to solve. because by trying to solve one aspect of the problem, we created and some other problems or many other problems. And normally because of its complex and nature and its actually interconnectedness nature, right? So you touch one thing, you affect other things. So there's some repercussions to all the solutions as proposed. So there are actually generally four major reasons why problems can be wicked, right? The first is that it's incomplete or contradictory knowledge. So when it comes to history, when it comes to architectural history, sometimes really we have incomplete or contradictory knowledge with the subject matter that we have. The second reason is that the number of people and the number of opinions involved, right? We know that there are a lot of people in architectural conservation. There are many stakeholders, past residents, current owners, the government as authorities, right? Members of the public, everyone have their opinions, right? So the number of people and number of opinions that's involved. And sometimes it's because of the large economic burden, right? Conservation is well perceived as expensive, but not necessarily so. So issues like, for example, like healthcare and poverty is also a large economic problem. Those are real wicked problems. The last and not least is that all these problems, they has the interconnected nature, right? So it's four general issues pertaining to what is a wicked problem. So I would like to ask this question: can conservation, architectural conservation, right, be considered as a wicked problem? Right. So maybe we can close the poll and you can share the poll while I continue with my sharing. So first and foremost, we'll ask ourselves, what exactly is conservation? Right. And here I'm showing you some standard definition from the Oxford University. But I would like to really highlight three different portions of the definition on the conservation and preservation or preserve. So in our context, preservation or conservation is a preservation and repair of archaeological, historical, and cultural sites and artifacts. So it's about archaeological, historical, and cultural sites as well as artifacts to preserve them. And then because it's to preserve them, what do you mean by preserve? Right? It's to maintain something in the original or existing state. And this brings us to the question, what is original? Right? Is there such a thing as original? And last but not least, the intangible. We have to maintain or keep alive a certain memory, right? Architectural conservation, as much as it's a tangible heritage, all the intangible social meanings happen within the tangible. So what exactly then is conservation? Is actually concerned with the transmission of our heritage, right? We want to transmit it. That's why we want to preserve and conserve it. For who? For not for just for ourselves, but for the future. So the present and the future. And this brings me to one of Xin Li's work. This drawing on the kuehs of Singapore. So I just drew up, the 𝗘𝗫𝗏𝗧, the different kind of lapis, and in line with today's title of the sharing session, the layers of architectural conservation. And in fact, we can replace architectural conservation with history, the layers of history. And if we can think of layering of history, right? Is there such a thing that, or of course there is such a thing that's original layer, right? That's the first and foremost original layer. But is there a value judgment to the varying layers, the subsequent layers that come upon each other? And how do we treat and understand all the layers in history? So when we talk about layering of history, right, we can look at it in many different scales, right, from the small scale to large scale, right? So like, for example, the Rempuhas has a book called SML XL, small, medium, large XL. So we look at different scale. In this particular case of architectural conservation, this is a very small scale, a micro scale. And here I have 3 images of pane layer section at 50 times magnification of cross section. They are taken from Clark Street, Redoubt Street, and Seligi Road. So the last one, which is the middle photograph on the right, that's from Seligi Road, which is the subject matter of Sand Precinct, right? And why are we interested in different scales? For example, here we are interested in a particular layers of history in terms of architectural pane. So is pane interesting to us or of historical interest? Some may argue that, paint, color is personal aesthetic and taste, right? So why should we be bothered by individual aesthetic and taste? Well, it's true that individual owners have their own right to paint certain colors on their building, but collectively, as a period, as a certain milieu, right? These aesthetic preference of colors do inform us about the aesthetic preference of the society at large. So here we have an example of a building in 𝗦𝗣𝗕𝗛𝗢𝗧 on Phillip Street, where we're interested in the color of the timber frame of the window. So we use a scalpel. This is known as a paint stratification analysis, right? We take a scalpel, we actually do a cratering of a size of not more than a 20 cents diameter in cratering site, and we take some samples, we embed it in an embedding medium in the lab, and we look at the cross section, and we use in this case a scanning electron microscope to look at the elemental analysis. So here you have the top row with zinc, lead, and titanium, and then the bottom row is calcium Ca, right? So these are corresponding to different layers of white color or white pigment, right? Why is this white interesting to us? Because the white color is perhaps a good timestamp for a country like Singapore, where we have a relatively short history, right? So for example, the earliest white that is used as a building pigment is calcium, so a lime wash, right? And then you have the invention of zinc white, which have a zinc, and subsequently lead white was used for a very long time until lead was banned for health reason, and it was replaced by titanium white, right? So all this give us a kind of indication on the timestamp of the particular paint layer. So this is a very macro scale. So let us bring back to a very macro level and look at the approach in which architectural conservation is situated in. Here I present to you two very extreme positions, right? One is promoted by John Ruskin of UK, United Kingdom, and the other one is in continental Europe in France, 𝗔𝗕𝗛𝗢𝗧 Villalet-le-Duc, right? And one is on the retention of status quo, conservation, don't do anything apart from conservation. Essentially, you want to prevent the subject matter of the object that you're looking at from further deterioration, right? There's no restoration, and restoration, as understood by John Ruskin, is the most total destruction. He used a very, very strong word, total destruction, because wherever you do or intervene onto an object, we're changing the nature of the object. So it's about total destruction. While Villalet-le-Duc talked about stylistic restoration, and he in fact is promoting restoration, although he did say that every addition form from whatsoever period should be in principle be conserved, consolidated, and restored, right? But to him, restoration is a means to establish a building to a finished state, which in fact may never have existed at any given time. So this is actually a discussion, if we could cast it wider, where Villalet-le-Duc is responsible for the Notre Dame in Paris that we are familiar with, the restoration of Notre Dame, right, before the Great Fire. So after the fire a couple of years ago, there are a lot of discussion how we should restore or conserve Notre Dame. So should we restore it back to how it looked like before the fire, i.e. going back to Villalet-le-Duc rendition of Notre Dame, or should it be restored in the spirit of Villalet-le-Duc's theory, which means that we restore it to a state which has never existed given a period of time? So hypothetically, we put a glass roof over the nave, for example. Is then that not in line with the spirit of Villalet-le-Duc, right? So let's come back to Singapore, since we'll look at the different kinds of the two very extreme theoretical positions. Here we are in the same vicinity. We have Raffles Hotel. And here I put up to you a kind of in between the two extremes, right? Whereby all innovation should be avoided and all forms faithfully copied where no trace of origin is left by studying and consulting the monuments of the same period, same style, and same country. But the problem with this is that although this is about rational stylistic unity, the site that Raffles Hotel Arcade sits was never Raffles Hotel. it was something else, right? The pharmacy, the medical office. So is this a kind of restoration in the 1980s? This 1989 to 1991, right? The restoration and, in fact, expansion of Raffles Hotel. Another example is 𝗘𝗫𝗛𝗧𝗓𝗔𝗞𝗘𝗥𝗦 Temple, right? A kind of philological and historical conservation, where the approach taken is the monument should show different facets of the history of different people. Right? We're talking about layering, and the layers, can we show off different layers? So we're not going back to the original, because what is the original is the photograph on the lower left. In this case, the front entrance hall of the temple. You can see instead of the cast iron balustrade that we are very familiar with, 𝗘𝗫𝗛𝗧𝗓𝗏, is actually in timber balustrade. Right. So the top two photographs shows after what have happened to the timber balustrade was taken away. It was actually the cast iron balustrade was actually put in 1907, right? And it also introduced polychromatic tiles, delft tiles, right, and encaustic tiles. Right? But today, if you go to 𝗘𝗫𝗛𝗧𝗓𝗏, we can still see the cast iron balustrade being conserved. The polychromatic dado tiles are conserved, except that unfortunately the delft tiles is no longer with us today. Right. The third example I'd like to show using this philological example is St. Andrew Cathedral. The top photograph shows an image whereby the transept, in this case, the south transept is actually relatively short, and the cathedral are expanded over the years with the south and north transept expanded to create larger space and room. And in this case, the lower image shows the existing photograph of St. Andrew Cathedral, where the south transept, the second story of south transept, is the office space of the cathedral, right? So, and then both the transept were actually constructed in reinforced concrete as compared to brick and lime of the main church itself. So the question is that layers of history, should we respect different layer of history, or should we go back to the original layer, right? And which means that we have to demolish subsequent additions by different people. And let's move on, zoom out a little bit, right? We talk about the architectural layer, architectural stratification. We can also talk about the urban stratification. And in fact, if we can go down into a more micro, into archaeological stratification. So archaeological is underground heritage, architecture above ground heritage, and then we can even go up to the urban stratification. So in the last iteration of this sharing session was by Dr. Lee Xin Li, and Dr. Lee had talked about the different communities and that existed within this district where SAMS is situated in. And if you have missed Dr. Lee's excellent sharing session, you can scan the QR code here that will bring you to the recorded session by Dr. Lee. So in my presentation, I will not focus very much on all the social history, and if you're interested in this aspect of history of this region, and I will urge everyone to scan the QR code and watch Dr. Lee's sharing. So one very important and very simple way and very useful way to understand how a site change is what we call map regression, or sometimes it's called historical map regression. It's a very useful way to study our landscape and to understand different layers, right? And here I included a QR code, a very useful resource from the Scottish Heritage site. So if you are interested to know more about map regression, please scan the QR code and you'll find more information about what is map regression. So what I've shown here is a blow-up partial showing of the Jackson plan. So we're using maps and different kind of illustration to understand the different layers. But of course, there is certain bias. We need to understand how maps and plans work, right? The very fact that it's called plan. A plan is the planning for the future. It may or may not be implemented fully. So we have to understand a Jackson plan as such. And even for a map is typically surveyed as is, but different maps have a different focus point. So if we understand who the map is made for and why is it made for, then we could understand the illustration and the depiction on the map or the plan better. So as taking a cue from Dr. Lai, where he uses the middle road axis and the north brick road axis, I also use the same, so it's easier for everyone to orientate ourselves. So from the 1822 Jackson Plan, we know that this area is also known, or rather envisioned to be known as the Rochor Square area. However, we also know from history that this plan for this area was not exactly realized. So what did it bring us to? And this is an 1825 map that is being kept at the British Library. And we can see here, this is one of the early, because of the map, this is from a surveyed kind of situation on the ground. We can see that the area that we're looking at from this map regression exercise, that the North Bridge Road and the has been laid out 2 blocks, or rather 4 blocks, right? If we take each quadrant as a block, has been laid out rather rectilinear, cellular kind of structure, while this area of sand is still sort of undeveloped site, right? So this 1825. And we move on to some sort of artist's impression, right? So this is a lithograph of the site taken from Fort Canning. But as with all artists' illustration or lithograph, we need to understand that there might be some artistic license being taken. But this is actually a good way to understand and give us the impression how the area might have looked like. So this is taken from 1830. And if I look at the circle, so there you can see that, well, yes, from the 1825 map, we can know that sites and areas are parcellated out, right? And it emerged some sort of this individual bungalows that is standing along the landscape, the kind of early start, the nascent start of the land. This is another very famous watercolor painting, right? And this is also taken from Fort Canning, and you can see it sort of reiterated what the earlier lithograph has depicted to us: a series of individual buildings, including a church there, and that will be later known as the Cathedral of the Good Shepherd. Right. So looking at how we look at maps and historical map regression, here I have 2 maps of 1844 and 1881. And what you can see here is that from the building footprint, those that is shaded in black, right, that within an expanse of 40 years, there is a sudden explosion of density of development along the site. And if you already notice, the area around Kampong Glam area is actually very dense, while the area around Sam area, right, it's actually rather sparse as compared to the area in Sam, right? So here we have another map of 1881, and I superimpose it with the earlier one that was shown in the previous slide, right? And although these 2 maps are dated the same date, right, 1881, this actually sort of illustrate what I mentioned about the intention of maps, right? So the map on the right essentially want to show a kind of network, a kind of building density, while the larger map on the left is showing building allotment, right? Not all of the building footprints were shown. What were drawn in shaded in pink, right, or light red, are the more important building on the site, right? So, for example, you can see that the Church of St. Joseph is there. You can see that the Cathedral Good Shepherd is there. You can see that what is known as chimes today, which is the convent, is there. And then, of course, the convict prison, where SMU now stood, is there. Right? So again, we look at maps, we need to understand what is the purpose of the map. And of course, the larger map, you can see that there's also an annotation where above Waterloo Street, they say Kampong Bencoolen, right? So there's actually associated with a certain community that live around the area. So again, if you're interested in social history, I would urge you to revisit or watch Dr. Lai's presentation. Here we are, we're moving on to the 1893 plan. And here is a much more detailed plan, showing not only the allotment, but also the building footprint. And it seems like from the 1880s to 1890s, right, it's actually quite stable. And in fact, if we look at the 1893 plan and we correspond to what our landscape look now today, they are actually quite highly similar. We can find vestiges of history with this particular plan, right? So this plan is also available in the National Archives of Singapore. If you also look at, if you just search for it, you can access a very good image of this plan online. This is a much later one. This is the Gazette of Singapore 1935. And here, this is probably, the intention is mainly for tourists, or I said it's a street network, a street directory. And hence, the building footprints were not very well depicted. They were just kind of shaded in large blocks of colors. From plan, we also look at some of the images, right? So this is probably in the mid-20th century. And it also gives us a good impression of how the entire district might look like, right? And here is an image probably also taken from Fort Canning. And you have Sam in the foreground, the former St. Joseph Institution, right? And we see St. Peter and St. Paul Church, we see St. Joseph Church, Sultan Mosque in the background, and also in the foreground, the Cathedral, Good Shepherd. And from this particular angle, we can actually make up a lot of large compound houses or individual buildings, less so of shop houses in this particular area. And this has been attested by the various maps that were shown through the historic map regression exercise that I've shown you earlier on. The next image is probably familiar to you because this is a courtesy of Dr. Lai's presentation. It's taken probably from where Kete is now. And here, I also have marked out the various landmarks. We have the Lady of Luz in the far ground, the background, and the Sultan Mosque, and the Guaning Tong Hokzo Temple and Sri Krishna Temple on Waterloo Street is also marked up there. But in this particular image, it conveys a very different kind of atmosphere of the area to us. Here we see in the foreground, especially the rows of shop houses, right, that we are familiar in parts of Singapore, especially this area, as well as the Kampong Glam area. And in the background, you do see the Rochor and the river estuary. Right? And you can see that there are, again, along Middle Road, there are also series of shop house fronting Middle Road. This is actually a very interesting or important plan we call the Eric Lawrence plan, right? And Eric Lawrence was actually invited to Singapore in the early 1960s and carry out a study of the urban revitalization of Singapore, right? And at the same time, the planning authorities also thinking about how do you want to refresh or rather redevelop areas of Singapore, which then the common terminology used is that we have a lot of slums, right? Of course, today we know that that's perhaps a rather incorrect depiction of the kind of dwelling that people live in the shop houses, right? They are not slums, but it was quite understood as slums. So this plan was sort of partitioned the north and south of the river into several precincts, right? From where we are interested in the north of Singapore River. So N1 all the way to N9. N1 is where Crawford Estate is today, right? So Crawford Estate is completed around 1970s, early 70s, and it's in a way a kind of a result of this Eric Lawrence plan. And N2 is where the Malay cemeteries are, right? The N3, it's the gateway, the dual residences, right? And N4, Kampong Glam area. N5, we have Bugis and Albert Street Center. And then N6 will be the High Street Center at Funan area. N7, Waterloo Complex, Bras Basah Complex. N8, Bugis Street, Liang Xia Street, Tan Quee Lan, right? And N9, which is at today's the Serangoon Garden areas, Serangoon Road area, Cliff Street, Dunlop Street, and Dixon Street. So some of you may wonder, how come within our historic landscape, as close as what is left today of Kampong Glam and some vestiges around SAM areas of historic buildings, we have so much new developments. And in part, the Eric Lawrence plan has a lot to do with this phenomena. So this image is also taken from courtesy of Dr. 𝗧. This shows some of the HDB's development as a result of the planning actions taken in the 1960s all the way implemented to the 1970s and even the 80s. Of course, today we know that Rochor Center has since been demolished. The Waterloo Center and Bras Basah complex is still with us today. So let's go back to a little bit more into history, right? And we'll look at three particular buildings as differing layers. The first is the Guaning Tong 𝗘𝗫𝗛𝗡 Temple, right? It's a Teochew Buddhist building. The original architecture is a classic Teochew architecture. If I may draw your attention to the roof ridge, it is what we call in Chinese a 𝗘𝗫𝗛𝗧, right? You can see that there's actually two horizontal ridge lines that is sort of separated with some filigree work. So it's actually, there's voids between the two lines, right? So this is a very beautiful rendition of the ridge, which this particular type of ridge you can never find in any building in Singapore today, right? Unfortunately, we have lost this particular way of construction in Singapore. You can still find this back in China, or if you go to Taiwan, you can still find this particular way of rendition. So in the 1980s, the building was torn down and was replaced by the building that we're very familiar with on the right, right? So this is the Guaning Tong 𝗘𝗫𝗛𝗡 Temple on middle Waterloo Street. So the question is that the 1980s rendition of the temple, right? And it's actually very important aspect of the social history to a lot of Buddhists in Singapore, right? Is this then not understood as heritage? Right? The next example, also along the same street, is Sri Krishnan Temple, right? The Sri Krishnan Temple that I may venture to say that for the bulk of us today, we're familiar with the image on the right, right? But what is its original form is the image on the left, right? There is actually no gopuram, right? There is the main prayer hall, right? And there is this inner shrine where the gods are being placed and venerated, right? You can see a little dome, that's a shrine, right? And there's no gopuram. So what happened to this building? The building was actually extensively renovated. I use the word renovated, right? Expanded in 1980s, right? Late 1980s, 1985 to 1989. And the gopuram, which is the entrance gateway, right, was added. Today, this building has been gazetted as a conserved building in 2014. And what consisted of its conservation status, right, is actually the gopuram, right? Interestingly, the gopuram is included. The main prayer hall and the boundary walls were actually gazetted for under conservation. So even you look at the prayer hall, right, which was a very simple roof form, which is this interesting cantilever ledge that's coming out, and you compare it with the image of the right, which is the current rendition, right? There are more ornaments actually being placed at the edge of the parapet wall on the roof. So the question is that, is Sri Krishnan temple, as we know it of today, with the Gopuram, is the Gopuram then not heritage, or is it heritage? Right. The last example is Malabar Mosque, right? Right? And Malabar Mosque is a relatively recent building, right? It's constructed or completed in 1963, and for a long time, for around 30 years, right? The image on the left, the building is not tiled. The building is a plain rendered in surface render and painted over. It's only again in the late 1980s, right? 1988, 1989, that there was actually an appeal for funds to renovate the mosque. And by 1991, the mosque is completed with its iconic blue and white tiles on the entire facade of the mosque, which give a very distinctive visual anchor or landmark to this particular junction. So again, the question is that, is this blue and white facade tiles be considered as heritage, right? Since it's only being put in back in around 1989 to 1991. So what's then for us today? So today, this is the master plan of 2019. So if we actually look at this master plan and we compare it with all the historical maps that we have shown you earlier on, especially the 1893 one, you can see that we still have vestiges, pockets of buildings that reminds us of what it was there, at least in 1893. But we have since moved on from 1983, and different layers of history have been added on to the original layers. Well, we can look at it as whether this is an enrichment of history or even degradation of history. Of course, there's a value judgment that we can look at and ponder about, right? From the master plan, so this is taken from Google Earth, right? And this is how it looked like today, right? Those areas that you see terracotta tiles, those are the historic areas. We can see Kampong Glam area that we know of, Serangoon Road area further up to the north, and you can see around the very close to Sam area, all the red terracotta tiled roof are somewhat vestiges of the history of the past. So by showing everyone how we go about doing a map regression, I try to understand different layers of history and questioning our original question: can conservation be wicked? So in order for us to understand conservation as a wicked problem, we need to understand the different layers of history. In the last 10 years or so, I think the Singapore various government authorities, for example, the National Library Board, the National Archives of Singapore, they have done a wonderful job in what I call the democratization of historical knowledge, right? So they have placed quite a number of things digital online. As much as academic, I wish that they could digitize more and more and make more things available for the public. But I must congratulate them for doing such a good job. So here are 3 websites that is actually very useful for us to try to understand the different layers of history, right? You can have one search where you can link to many different photographs, maps that we can find of a particular district. And then the newspaper, SG, the digitized newspaper, historic newspaper, also provide a huge, rich source of information for us to understand the different layers. So last but not least, I would like to come back to Xin Li's illustration on the lapis. So if we understand lapis is actually very delicious to eat, right? The kueh is sweet, right? Whether do we enjoy it layers by layers, as some of us do as a young boy or a young kid, I always like to peel lapis and eat it layer by layer, or we enjoy it with one bite, one mouthful. It's always a pleasant experience eating lapis, right? And for lapis, every layer tastes the same, right? So there is no privileging of the older layer or the newer layer. So should we then look at history as such as the layering of historical knowledge, layering of things that we put on, as much as some of the things that happened in the past, if we put on the lens of today, may not seem to be that sensitive, but at a point of time in history, I would like to think that people then perhaps thought that that is the best way to do certain things. Thank you very much, Roger, for allowing me to share my short presentation with you today. Thank you. Xin Li, you are being mute. Xin Li, we can't hear you. You're still muted.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Yeo, for the presentation. So now we move to the Q&A session. We'll stop taking questions around 5 minutes before 12 p.m. And I already see some questions coming in. One from for me and one for Prof. Yeo. So for myself, I also draw modern buildings, and some of the buildings that I did previously, I drew the Shaw Tower, which is currently under in the process of being demolished. I drew Rochor Complex as well, and People's Park, but they are relatively old now compared to say your Duo, etc. And yes, I still find new buildings, old buildings, atmospheric, but sometimes I include modern buildings so that to inform the context of where some of these buildings are. Like if I drew the former High Court and where it used to be a Hong Lim Park, I will also draw Park Royal Pickering in the background. So in one of my works, Science Singapore, you can find such landscape where it mix both new and old landscapes together. For the question for Dr. Yeo, as there are many layers in architectural conservation, who gets to decide on which layer is the most authentic and hence to be conserved? When is the building going to be conserved? And if then the questioner also believe that a successful conservation must also recreate a unique spatial experience associated with particular conserved building. In this case, can modern architectural intervention, such as addition of a wall to block unsightly surrounding context and noise, to be tolerated in the conservation of a building, as long as they are subtle and blends in with the conserved building?
Yes, thank you very much for the question. I think it's a very relevant question, a rather complicated and difficult question to answer. So let's look at it as who get to decide first, right? So I think we can look upon this question as a very narrowly focused or very broadly focused. If we look at a very narrow definition of who decides, right? And then I would say that in some cases where we have conserved building, the building has been gazetted, whether as a conserved building or national monument, the government have decided what they want to keep and what they do not want to keep, right, in a way. Or rather, I would say they won't decide what they do not want to keep, what areas whereby new intervention could take place, right? Let's take a very broad definition of who decides, because that's also in a way answer how government authorities decide, right? So first thing first, we need to understand different layers, and I would certainly want to go beyond the building itself. We look at the urban context, like the historical map regression, so what constitutes the surrounding of the site before going into the building, and look at different scales, right? By carefully looking at different scales, where even down to the scale of pain, right? As I shared with you in the in early parts of the presentation, it will inform us of a lot of information, right? And thereabout, someone has to make a decision. The decision is always very complicated because we have many different stakeholders. So I cast the question as conservation is actually a wicked problem. But I do believe that because it's a wicked problem, as there's so many stakeholders, right? We need to build consensus among all stakeholders and base it really not on emotions, because when it sometimes come to talk about heritage and history, we are full of emotions, right? Because, oh, I grew up here, this is so familiar with me, you cannot change this, because I'm so associated with this particular way of doing things or how things are being presented. But let's try to take emotions out of the equation and work things through with different stakeholders, and thereby make a decision on how to keep. I presented different approaches to conservation, the two extreme end, John Ruskin and 𝗕𝗏𝗧, but in actual fact today, we tend to take the middle ground, right? We try to show different aspects of history on a particular building. And because we have to intervene, right? Once we intervene, it's almost like the act of curating. We are showing off certain aspects. We are sort of covering up, or even worse, erasing certain aspects of history, right? So I say even worse. So the role of documentation would then be very important. So before we do any intervention, as much as intervention would like to be reversible, nothing is 100% reversible, proper documentation should be done. To the last point of the question, right? Can modern architecture intervention be considered? Say yes, why not? Right? Certainly. But before you do that, because this kind of modern intervention may or may not remove or erase certain layers of history, right? We have to document it. Right? So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Dr. Prof. Yeo. And there's another question from Jeff, and he asking, since every layer is equally significant, as much as we respect public needs and demands, how do you balance the organic renewal, such as modernization and the conservation of buildings? I think some recent project that was being mentioned is like 𝗘𝗫𝗛𝗡 complex, because some of the certain equipment hard to find nowadays, and there's this debate whether how do you go about renewing such a building?
Well, yes, I would say that maybe let me steer away from 𝗘𝗫𝗛𝗡 complexes, because that's a different building of a different scale, and the issues might be different. But let me give a classic example. Say, hypothetically, say we have a temple, right, or a historic temple, or historic mosque, or historic Hindu temple, wherever it is, or Sri Krishna temple. The early iteration when they were built, normally they don't have good or modern day plumbing that's built together with the building, right? So we know that today we definitely need modern day plumbing. We need to provide hygienic sanitation, toilets, washroom for users of the space, for the stakeholders. Then how do we add all these modern amenities within the historic building, right? So this, I think, in the same vein to an earlier question, can modern intervention or insertion on the wall be allowed? I say yes, certainly. We have to bring the building back, or rather building up to standard, to certain modern day expectation amenities. But something that is maybe even more controversial is that, is there a need for air condition? Right? I think in Singapore we are very familiar, very used to having our internal spaces air conditioned, especially for public spaces or religious spaces. So if you look around our city centers, even for all the historic churches that we see today, after restoration, you can more or less expect air condition to be inserted. So long air condition can be inserted sensitively and doesn't detract from the architectural experience or spatial experience, I think that's sort of allowed, yeah, in my own opinion. Yeah. So I hope that that sort of answer the question.
There's also another question here. If the building is to be restored, how do you decide which historical era it should belong to?
Yes. Okay.
Are there generally any best practices for it?
Okay, there is no particular time period that we should privilege or not privilege, I would say. So the first best practices that we will have to do is that we have to do a thorough study of the building, right? A thorough study of the building, and we understand then at what point of time the building is at its most glorious period. So it's, let's say, for example, say in a lot of Gothic churches in Europe, Gothic churches are actually built across centuries, right? A few hundred years. So if we insist that we restore it back to the original may be a very simple building. It's not what we expect of the glorious kind of Gothic buildings that we associate the Gothic churches to be, right? And so if we are able to understand which period is so-called the most glorious architecturally, then perhaps that is a kind of a milestone. I would say milestone, not necessarily that we restore back. Then we look at, okay, what happened next after this particular milestone? Are subsequent additions appropriate to the and complements the Gothic architecture? So back to the Singapore example, and if we look at just across from SAM, the Cathedral of the Good Shepherd. Right? So if you visit Cathedral of Good Shepherd, if you take a look at the windows, the original iteration of the Cathedral of Good Shepherd is a timber casement window. Right? What you see now today is mild steel frame with a green tinted glass window, center pivoted window. Right? So is that iteration, which is a much later addition when mild steel became popular in Singapore, and that we believe that probably around 1930s to 1960s period of time, be part of the history of the building. Right? And of course, the decision of the cathedral and the consultant team decided that that is also important, and they kept that particular architecture feature intact and restored it. The same example of the Cathedral of Good Shepherd is the mosaic behind the altar. The mosaic patterns behind the altar that was designed by Mr. Alfred Wong, our pioneer architect in Singapore. And again, that is not original, as we understood original as the first day when the cathedral is completed, right? So is that part of history important? Yes, because when Mr. Alfred Wong is doing his intervention to the cathedral, that's a time where it's the Vatican II Council decree that causes or resulted in some changes to the internal configuration of the church. So that's also an important historical significance in why certain things were made to change during the particular period of time. Yeah, so I hope that this is a sort of answer the question of how do we decide which layer, or how do we try to represent different layers in the restoration or conservation.
Thank you, Dr. Yeo. Then one of the analogy that has been brought up during here is the 𝗘𝗫𝗎𝗧 analogy. So there was a question whether when a few layers start to disappear, maybe over time, and there's a collective loss of memory, shouldn't certain layers of the lapis be given higher priority than others? Because I think sometimes during my drawings, I also face certain things that people ask me to draw like certain buildings, but like I can imagine that if I draw Queenstown now, I draw the Queenstown Cinema. I wonder if say 20 years down the road, will people still remember what building this is? Yeah. Because some of the buildings I draw, like even for the National Theatre, there are some of my younger friends who don't even recognize that building anymore, even though it's such a major landmark for I think quite a number of people here today in audience, that they remember the National Theatre, or at least the imagery of it.
Yeah, so this is actually very a question that's very pertaining to being human, right? I myself struggle with this problem, being human, right? We have all our personal preferences and priorities, and we like certain things and don't like certain things, right? But as an academic myself, right, I try to refrain from passing judgment too soon, right? But of course, layers will disappear. It will disappear from our landscape, right? But that doesn't mean that you disappear in history, and which is why organizations like the National Archives or the National Library Board are important, because they are repository of knowledge and memories, right? So I kept stressing on the need of documentation. Documentation is very important. There is this term known as preservation by record. I don't really like this term. I don't really promote this because sometimes preservation by record is a convenient excuse for us to demolish and rebuild, right? So, but in the last, whatever that we do or intervene, even the building is standing, we should preserve every action or intervention through recording it. So not just only when we are demolishing a building, then we preserve our record. So record keeping is actually very important because it also informs future people that come along to restore the building, what has been done during the period of time when you are working on the building. Because as I mentioned earlier, every intervention is a decision, is an act of curation. You are enhancing certain things, you are erasing certain things or hiding certain things. And this is based on the value judgment of you yourself as a conservator or collectively as a group of stakeholders find important at the particular period of time, right? Where society thinks that it's okay. But subsequently, people may not think so, right? So if we're able to have good documentation, we may be able to undo or reverse some of the intervention that was carried out during the time when we are interventing in the building. Yeah,
I see. I think this one, there's this question probably is very technical. So there's this question that asks, how do you see architecture conservation in the context of urban conservation?
I see that it's actually very closely related, right? Urban conservation. What exactly is urban conservation? Right? Urban conservation is related to the landscape, right? There's a concept called HUL, historic urban landscape, where we look at not just building as an individual building in that's divorced from the entire surrounding and context, but we consider the entire context. So a classic example is our shop house, right? One shop house may not be interesting, right? So some of our shop house around Singapore were much later. They were the modernist period of shop house, very plain and simple. There's not much decoration. Or if we go back to the earliest shop or the oldest one, you can find some of those in Bussorah Street. Very simple proportions, in a way quite squat. The floor to ceiling height is rather low, not much of decoration. So if you look at a shop house by itself, right? If we remove the historically, just as architectural entity by itself, it may not seem that interesting. But if we consider the shop house as a row of shop house along the entire street, right? It starts to gain a certain different perspective, right? So that is how, in a way, architectural conservation and urban conservation, I think they are very closely related. They cannot be divorced from one another.
Then there's also a question, I think this is related to your previous one of your projects. So this question named Meilan want to ask, what is the value of installing an antique Chinese building in SUTD? The structures are referring to the Chinese structures donated by 𝗘𝗫𝗛𝗏 to SUTD.
Well, I can't really answer this question, but I can only answer this question on hindsight, right? The historical fact about this donation is that this donation was being proposed by the donor, which is the 𝗘𝗫𝗛𝗏, Mr. 𝗘𝗫𝗛𝗏, to the then minister, which is George Yeo. So Minister George Yeo accepted the donation, and after the decision is taken to accept the donation, the state then have to think of who will be the recipient of the donation, right? So in a way, then SUTD, the Singapore University of Technology Design, where I'm now currently with, is being asked to be the recipient of these historic buildings. So bearing aside this whole controversy, even I will say, venture say controversy of the issues pertaining to relocation of heritage site, which I think can only be done at the last resort. This is my personal opinion. But if we take that consideration aside, all buildings, historic buildings, are should not be given priority. Just like I say, all different layers of 𝗘𝗫𝗡𝗧 should be treated the same. Is there such a thing as big building or important building? And is there such a thing as insignificant heritage? To me, I would think that we should treat heritage the same, right? And if we treat heritage the same, then as a conservator, it's my role professionally to help to conserve and prevent the building from deteriorating. So that's in a way the kind of answer we can give on hindsight. So of course, one of the major criticisms is that this particular building has no sole reference or relationship to Singapore. Yes, indeed, they are what I would call imported heritage, right? But in a way, we can also learn about classical or rather Qing and Ming dynasty Chinese houses in Zhejiang, how they were built as a kind of educational value, more of an educational value than historical value, because the history is not relating to Singapore. It's actually back to Zhejiang, China.
I think that for Singapore, one of the most well-known efforts to move a piece of heritage is the 𝗘𝗫𝗛𝗢𝗫𝗔𝗫𝗓, right? Then I think in Japan, there's also examples of such as there's this place called 𝗦𝗣𝗘𝗔𝗞𝗘𝗥𝗦 in I think Aichi Prefecture, where they consolidate a lot of these Meiji era structures from around Japan, partly because it's also due to urban redevelopment. Otherwise, this building would have been demolished. That also includes Frank Lloyd Wright's Imperial Hotel. They assemble it at 𝗦𝗣𝗘𝗔𝗞𝗘𝗥𝗦.
So maybe if I interject here, if I may interject here, right? Most of the time it's due to urban redevelopment. But the thing is that should a building give way to road or road give way to building, right? So this is always the major debate, right? So as much as possible, we should try to avoid building giving way to road. We should, as much as possible, all the planners, right, should try to avoid that, right, in the first place. But it's only in the fact that it's inevitable, right? In the last resort, then I would say that we need to document very well in the original site before the relocation. So some other examples in Singapore, other than the 𝗘𝗫𝗛𝗢 example, right, would be the gateway of Bukit Brown Cemetery, right? The gate posts and the metal gates were relocated to a new site because of relocation.
Is it Nanqiao school gate you were involved also, right?
Yes, in a way, yes. I'm involved in the relocation exercise and conservation of the Nanqiao school gate from Kim Yen Road to Sengkang, where the school is now being located.
Well, then, because on the theme of today's presentation about layers, so within the context of history as a palimpsest, is the concept or question of authenticity moot? This is a question from one of the audience.
Yes. So the question is the question is how do we define authenticity, right? What is authenticity? Is the authenticity privileging the material? Then if yes, then material from which era or which period of the building? So it's actually a very, very difficult question to answer. Or should we take authenticity as in the spirit of the Nara document on authenticity in 1994, where even the intangible, right, the skill set, the craftsmanship of the craftsman building it, right, can be taken as authenticity. So I think this authenticity, whereby since 1994 in Nara and the Nara document on authenticity, sort of being adopted, especially in Asia, because as much as in Asia, in Singapore, we have a lot of brick building, right, masonry building. We also have building that's constructed from organic materials, which is timber. And timber doesn't lend itself to centuries of preservation, especially in our climate. So at some point of time, the timber has to be refreshed, has to be changed to or replicated, right? And the answer to that authenticity then is not about the authenticity of the material fabric itself, but the authenticity of how we make it and the form, rather than the material. So I think this is the question of authenticity is always being questioned. It's always, even down to the authenticity of the finishes, right? For example, the paint. So one question is that in the museum setting, or the fine arts setting, the finishing, the paint work is actually utmost authentic because that's what the artist painted on the canvas. While in the case of architecture, is architectural paint important? To me, yes, of course, right? If not, I would not even attempt to look at the architectural paint research, right? But I also have to reconcile that paint is also a sacrificial layer. We paint a building to protect the building fabric, right? So there's always this whole question, a range of, in a way, how we understand this word authenticity.
Another question, I think, from Dr. Lai. So would you say that the Singapore Art Museum or the former SGI was a good effort of conservation, and how would you rate it?
Okay, I think we need to, I always say that when we try to evaluate conservation efforts, right? So my first question is there such a thing as what is good architectural conservation, and vis-a-vis then what is bad architectural conservation, right? If we want to evaluate it, then we have to look at it at the point of time, right? So that was done in the early 90s, right? And then so what is the predominant thinking about restoration and conservation at a particular point of time? So an example of Raffles Hotel, which I gave earlier on, if today we still have the medical office standing along North Bridge Road, and Raffles Hotel has to be expanded, right? Will we do the same thing as the Raffles Hotel Arcade? The answer is then no. Absolutely no, right? We will not demolish authentic shophouse row to build something that is replicated as a neoclassical building. So to me, if we put on today's lens, that is actually falsification of heritage. Then I would say no. So back to the case of Sam, and then we look at early 1990s. So at that point of time, I would say that generally, I would think that it's a rather good example of conservation. Of course, there will be issues, right? Number one is that it's being changed from a school to a museum. That's a first issue that we have to grapple with. In a school form, the spatial experience is a cellular space, right? The classroom and classroom and classroom. So when you have to change the gallery, right? You don't expect your gallery user to go in and out of classroom doors from one classroom to another classroom. So what they have done is that they remove the intermediate walls of the classroom to form an elongated space, right? And that is your gallery space, right? So in a way, it sort of removes the cellular experience of a classroom, right? So we ask ourselves today, right? Is that appropriate? If we put on today's
a similar situation when they're converting the National Gallery, like converting the Supreme Court and City Hall into the National Gallery as well, right?
Well, it's a similar thing. So these are issues. For example, since you mentioned the National Gallery, we have to differentiate, right? National Gallery, we have the two buildings, City Hall and Supreme Court. So it's more difficult to intervene in the Supreme Court because the courtrooms are highly ornate, right? So it's actually quite difficult to put in new intervention. But the City Hall section, what is a City Hall building as a building, right? Apart from the City Hall, where today commonly known as the surrender chambers, the municipal chambers, the rest of the building are office space, right? And office space, they have actually relatively a low floor to ceiling height. So when you have, and then you have a sort of a series of columns, right? But in a gallery space, you can't have columns, too many columns in a gallery space. And you can't have low floor to ceiling height, right? So one of the decisions then is to remove the columns and to break some floor slab to create double volume space. So if you go to the National Gallery today, the City Hall component, and enter the galleries, the internal spatial experience will be very different from the internal spatial experience of City Hall when it was a municipal office space, right? So these are the questions that we ask ourselves. So if the decision is then made to rehouse or repurpose a new programmatic function into a building. In the case of SAM, which is a school building, into a gallery, a museum, then the intervention in this particular case is, in a way, we lost all the internal walls. Right? So you have to be properly documented. What are the walls that were demolished, where they were demolished, and some cases whereby they will make some sort of physical marker to inform visitors to the site, where were these walls originally located.
So, because you also work on several of these projects, and I believe during your career, you also encounter different historians with differing opinions, or even sometimes like the quality of the research. Sometimes there's also certain debate about it. Right? So one of the questions was, how do you resolve like what is to be restored or conserved when you have such differing opinions, and is there a mediator to resolve such a differing opinion?
Yes, normally in conservation project, right, the architect is the lead consultant on the team, right, and then the architectural conservator works as a team with the lead architects, right, and we always try to have work on facts, try to take the emotion out of things, right, and work on facts, and the opinion, as a word opinion means, is about interpretation of facts. You may have different interpretation of the facts presented to you than my interpretation. So this kind of interpretation has to be tabled on a platform where different stakeholders will come to agreement. So I'm trying to think of whether there's any examples in this. So for example, say the House of 𝗘𝗫𝗏𝗧 building, right, along Clemenceau Avenue, opposite Istana Park, right? So during the restoration in 1999 to 2000, there was a decision to paint the external facade of the building yellow, right? So when it was painted in yellow, then in around 2000, when the building was opened, there was some discussion among the members of the public. Why is the building being painted yellow? Has the building been in yellow? Because in the consciousness of the public at the time, where the building has been used by the Salvation Army as a HQ, the building has always been white, right? So is there a yellow phase of the building? Well, yes, there was a yellow phase because they did some paint review among the color schemes that was reviewed on the House of 𝗘𝗫𝗏𝗧 project. There was a yellow layer, right? But of course, this yellow layer is sort of forgotten by people because it may be a very early on history when the building is painted in yellow.
It reminds me of the other project that I previously worked on. Is it 𝗔𝗕𝗛𝗢𝗧, the dome as well, right? Most people remember it as dark brown, but only until recently is revealed that there's actually this copper green layer.
Yes. So the dark brown and the green layer it's not because of different paint on it, it's because of the patination of the copper, right? Copper patinates the copper oxide changes color due to different atmospheric conditions. So the color do change.
Okay. Yeah. I think we probably only have the time to take a few more questions. So from Jen is that, so what are the lesser known considerations that go into the decision whether to conserve? And is there any building you could conserve? If there's one building that you can pick, and which one?
So I'm assuming that this question is not about the technical part of how to conserve, but on the decision, the government decision, what to legally protect and what not to protect. So I'm assuming that that's a question. Well, there are too many things that I want to. I will hope that the government will protect and conserve. Right? There's just too many. It's actually almost like although I don't have kids, right? Some people say if you have to have many kids and you have to ask the parents which kid you like best, right? It's such a very difficult choice to take. So I think that we should try our best to conserve as much as possible, right? To me, I think there's another question. I think conservation and development is always being cast as a bipolar relationship. But to me, I don't believe that's so, right? We can achieve development with conservation. It's a matter of planning, right? The the narrative that we always hear in Singapore is that we are a small country, we don't have enough land, and that's why we need to make way, historic places, we need to make way for development. I think there's a false dichotomy being placed up. It's true that land is scarce in Singapore, but space is not scarce. So what do I mean by space is not scarce? Because we can build up or we can build down. We increase density in greenfield site. We do not need to increase the density or redevelop on brownfield site or historic site just to create the density. So it's a matter of planning. If we're able to plan holistically, taking care with the intention of trying to keep as much historic fabric as we could, right? Then I think that there's no a dichotomy between the development and preservation.
I think also on that topic is that a lot of the new towns around Singapore, some of them went through a period of tabula rasa like Jurong, or even parts of Punggol, that a lot of this old history has been sort of sacrificed in the process of development. So one of the questions by Lee Xin Li is that outside in like modern heartlands where there are like less historical layers or less visible historical layers. So how do you how are these sites also like heritage sites for the future?
Yes.
But I think there's also certain work done recently by some of these groups, like my community has also been doing all this research in Bedok or Boon Keng. And there's also this group, Participate in Design, look at MacPherson and try to research on the heritage of these places and create little heritage centers for all these new towns as well.
Yes, I thank you for asking the question, because I think modern heritage of recent history tend to be most vulnerable, right? And because they are easily forgotten, they are too close to us in history, right? And we're so familiar with them that we don't even consider them as history. But they're important. So groups like my community or different groups, right, that advocate for the preservation of modern heritage, right, need to be supported. I think we need to support the advocacy. And why is this so? Because every generation, right, should create their own heritage. What is meaningful to them, right? And in Singapore, we are always moving very fast, right? We always lament that the school that I went to as a primary school boy or girl has been demolished. It's no longer there. So our memories, tangible memories, or intangible memories, where it's cited in tangible site, the tangible site is no longer there, right? So I think that it's important for every generation to value and articulate what is important to them, because these are the discussion would then being fed to the decision maker in the planning, right? What to privilege and what not to privilege when they're planning for development. So I think that it's important that we talk about our modern heritage, our HDBs, right? Estate. I think that HDB perhaps is the most sort of overlooked kind of heritage that we have in our landscape.
Okay, I think that this question is also related to the last one. This is the last question I'll be answering. So the question felt that older buildings generally, I think visibly it looks generally richer in their color scheme, unlike modern buildings that have this monochromatic color scheme. But I think some of the buildings until recently, because like maybe they have a brutalist architecture style, they are also not generally well liked until there's it stirs certain emotions. Like for Golden Mile, is because of the association with the Thai community, and even Shaw Tower, people in memories going to Sofra and going there to have 𝗘𝗫𝗛𝗧 ice cream. So when it comes to this kind of building, for building conservation, how do we bring back on the question of color scheme, how do you bring back the original color scheme of the conserved building if not traceable? Do we end up painting in a modern preferred color? So I think also this touches on, say, modern paints, they are like environmentally friendly, like absorb less heat or reflect more sunlight, etc.
Yeah. So I think this is back to my first few slides on historic paint research, right? And unfortunately for us today, we don't have a good database of historic paints, right? When I started looking at historical paints, it was probably around 10, 15 years ago. By then, we already lost a lot of historic fabric in Singapore. right? So as much as I could, right, it's in a way it's opportunistic, because in order to go to a building to do some paint scraping, I have to have the permission of the owner. When there are opportunities, I will just go and just collect samples, whether do I analyze it immediately or later, because analysis using equipments and scientific scanning electron microscope, there's also quite a hefty cost involved in that, right? So again, if we are able to look at a conservation project, when there's a project to conserve building, then again, I would say that we can then have the opportunity to look at historical paint layers, provided that the layers are still there. Why I say that the layers may or may not be still there, because when we do painting exercise, right, normally even you paint your house, right, the first thing is that you take a scraper, you scrape away all the loose paint, right? So over the course of history, some of the older paint may have been lost to this scraping, right? Another example is that in the recent years, in the last 10 years, there's a particular type of paint that's being promoted for historic building. That's why it's called silicate paint. But because silicate paint is a breathable type of paint, from a technical aspect, it allows the old building to breathe, right? As compared to emulsion paint. But for silicate paint to work, we have to scrape the building or the paint layers down to the substrate. So if, let's say, the consultant did not do a proper study and scrape the building down to the substrate and paint it with silicate paint, this means that we have lost all historical layers and information. We lost it, right? So there's a caution as well to use silicate paint. So why is this important? If we are able to trace historic colors, and if the stakeholders, owners are agreeable, then by all means, I would say bring back the historical colors. Again, if let's say the owner did not agree because of aesthetics judgment that's different, right? Unless the government stipulate that they have to bring back a certain color, right? Then I would say that, well, let's keep the historic layers, do a proper study, and have the opportunity to bring them back in the future and not to destroy the layer. Right? So an example, or maybe give just two examples before we can conclude. One is the Red House Bakery in Katong. Is the Red House Bakery originally red? No, it's not, right? But it has been associated with this color red. So obviously during the restoration, because it has been associated in the people consciousness, right, the public consciousness that this house is red, is painted red. Right? Another example is that the mural painting on 𝗦𝗣𝗘𝗔𝗞𝗘𝗥𝗦 temple on the facade, it has to be restored, right? But there are interesting historical brushwork on the mural. So what we have done is that we conserve the historical brushwork and colors. We paint a layer of protective coating on the historical layer. And before we do overpaint on this protective coating to restore it back to how it might have looked like in the past. So one day, if we think that we have done a wrong job in the overpainting, we can remove the overpaint and go back to the original paint layer, right? So I hope that sort of answers the question on paint layers and
Thank you, Prof. Yeo.
Yeah. Thank you.
So unfortunately, you need to end already because there's another session. The mural will be up to 6th of June. Thank you very much for joining us today. Yeah, so do visit the mural while you can. This session will be recorded, uploaded on Singapore Museum's YouTube channel as well. And yeah, so thank you very much, and hope to see you next time again. And thank you, Prof. Yeo, for sharing his technical and micro take on architectural conservation. You can visit the, yeah.
Thank you, Sam, and thank you, Singapore Museum, for allowing me to share. And thank you, Xin Li and Daryl. And do support Xin Li's and Daryl's artwork, and do visit them in person if you can. Be safe, observe safe distancing. And if you can't, please go on to the website and support our two young artists, Daryl and Xin Li. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and have a nice weekend.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.